Okay, great. Hi, welcome. I'm Dana Cowin, and I'm here we're all here to talk about the sustaining future for food. I hope that's why you're all here. You're interested in food and sustaining its future. I have an extraordinary panel of people who all look at this issue from slightly different perspectives. And I'll just go quickly down the line because that part's right. So we can hear just a little bit. Joanne, to my immediate left, you have a business of all the delicious things in life. Sure. There's a coffee shop, there's a bakery, and an ice cream shop in Lawrenceville, New Jersey. Aaron Choi, I was just on his farm, Girl and Doug, if anyone is near San Diego. Do you invite people out on the farm? No.
Increasingly so. We've started to reopen after the pandemic. Okay.
It's in a beautiful location doing 150 different ingredients, things grown from the ground that are spectacular. Michael Simristi, if any of you care about food at all, you have to know his restaurant, Providence, which is here in Los Angeles, as well as Connie and Ted. Not that that is lesser, they're just both great restaurants here in LA. And Rose Previtt, who is, well, you've lived here for a while, you have a new project that we'll hear about that is in Los Angeles, but has restaurants in Washington, DC, has a cookbook, Made On, which he's gonna be signing after, and has an import business for, do you call it import? For Goodare wines?
Yeah, direct to consumer.
Direct to consumer, okay.
E-commerce.
Wines from all around the world. So, I don't know how you guys feel about the word sustainability, but it's a very squishy one, and we put it in the title because it seemed like shorthand, but we're gonna start with, I'd love to hear about the work that each of you is doing in sustainability in your businesses, and starting with like how you even define the term. And I feel like it's never fair to be the one exactly next to the moderator, so I'm gonna start with you, Rose.
Oh, that's not fair. I thought I was going to get away with it. No problem. I think when I heard the title of the panel and as I was pondering on sustainability, I think kind of what I'm currently doing is a form of it. But like you said, there's a million ways to look at it. I have been troubled since COVID times, in restaurant times, with the sustainability of small businesses in urban cities like Washington, D.C., like Los Angeles. So many of us were lost during the last 4 years, and those of us that made it are still recovering. I know some people find that surprising, but we are, like emotionally, mentally, financially, as we all are as a society. But I think in our specific little industry, we got rocked in a particular way. So I've been wondering, like, how are we going to do this? How are restaurants, as the cost of everything is going up all the time, from rent to food, the menu prices, the way I had to raise them last year, it felt terrible. I didn't want to do it. There's absolutely no other way to do it with the price of food going up. So the project I'm doing here in LA is probably the best example of what I consider an attempt to sustain small businesses. You know, I'm a Lebanese American entrepreneur. I come from a long line of them. It's like in our DNA or something to open businesses. So I fear very, very much the loss of small business, and I refuse to believe we can't do this together. So Made On Market, which will open here in Los Angeles in the West Adams neighborhood later this year, is actually a community of small restaurants that I'm gonna be putting under one roof, and we're gonna share resources because truly, it is so hard to do business as a restaurant in LA. I can vouch for 10 years of doing it in DC by the skin of my teeth. And I just started to decide, like, if we didn't share things, one, from an actual, maybe the more traditional definition of sustainable, like sharing water, sharing literally fire. We're gonna have a large fire in the middle of the room. So not every business will have its own appliances. We're gonna share
controlled fire.
Very controlled. So regulated, my fire. Don't worry, it's very safe. But like in some, I always say like a village, we always say like the figurative, like sharing the well. So in this space, you're gonna be sharing fire, all the utilities, janitorial services, in the hopes that maybe separating the costs in this kind of communal way will make businesses that would not be able to open in the first place. Some will get a second location, and some will be folks that have, been a street, have just a spot on the street, who have never had brick and mortar, who I'm hoping to come into the space at a reasonable price, and lower the barrier to entry so these small businesses can still exist. And I don't know if it's a model, it's a test. I don't know. I'm hoping it'll work and maybe more people will do it. But we're going to try it and I'll let you know how it goes. But the mission behind all of it is the sustainability of small business in food and beverage.
That's great. Michael, we're just going to go really boring just down the row.
Providence and Connie Ted's are both, seafood restaurants. And so, if you'd have asked me this question 15 or 20 years ago when we first opened, I would have talked to you about the sustainability of the seafood that we use and the way we choose the species that we put on the menu and all that kind of stuff. And those are still very important benchmarks for me in terms of sustainability. But now I just kind of feel like that is a minimum expectation for restaurants, at least of the kind that I would want to be a part of. But now I have a much more holistic view of sustainability and think a lot about the impact that we have on our community. And when I say I don't mean that in a positive way. I mean restaurants create a tremendous amount of waste. I think about ways to try and manage that. We have a big composting program that we do at the restaurant and a recycling program. We grow as many ingredients as we can on our rooftop with a big garden that we built over the last many years. We keep bees up there. So I think that is a positive for the community that we're in. And again, just constantly thinking about ways to lessen the impact that we have on the world, really. Because, obviously a restaurant is just a microcosm and it's a small community of both employees and guests, and there's all sorts of commerce that's happening throughout the day. And, as a part of that commerce, there's a tremendous amount of waste that we generate, and I'm just really spending a lot of time thinking deeply about how to reduce that.
So I know that you're saying that fish was sort of baseline, but fish is an incredibly compelling and challenging in the world of sustainability right now. And I'd love to hear, we were talking a little bit about it, we get to have lunch together, so get a little preview. But I'd love to hear what you were thinking about with fish and how climate change is affecting fish and the way that you approach buying and the fishers that you work with.
Yeah, I mean, it's affecting everything. I mean, if you're a California resident, you might know that there's no king salmon season this year for the second year in a row. And that has, as much to do with water policies within the state as it does with the actual harvest of wild king salmon. So much water is being diverted to agriculture and other uses that the streams and the rivers that wild salmon rely upon to spawn are no longer hospitable to their young. As a matter of fact, the eggs never make it in many cases. The waters are so warm, if the salmon can return at all, that they just can't propagate as a wild species. And we have a big hatchery program here in California, which kind of has propped up the species for many years, but the effects of global warming are starting to impact that at a rate that is greater than the boost that they've been given by the hatchery system here in California. So those are troubling things. I mean, we have fishermen small boat fishermen that we work with here in California that just can't get out to fish because of the winds and because of that, and clearly caused by climate change. I mean, we've been dealing with some of these same people for years and years, and it's never been as bad as it is right now. And so I think these are real-time effects that we're starting to see that are having a real great impact on the state of wild fish.
And what about the state of sustainable fish? You were saying that's also perversely affected. You think you've got sustainable fish, you're like, great,
yeah.
But that's also a challenge.
Yeah, so aquaculture, most of which is done near shore. With all the rains that we've had in California, farms are forced to shut down because, industrial runoff, agricultural runoff that finds its way into the water table at sea often causes the closure of farms of things like oysters and clams and mussels, which are, deemed, very, very sustainable. And if your aqua farm happens to be offshore, again, winds and waves might keep you off the water.
Yeah, so much more. But then we get to go to the land and the agriculture, which is taking up a lot of the water. Aaron, sorry about that. Really,
it's all my fault.
Segue here.
It's all my fault. So on our farm, we're actually looking at honing in on the subject of sustainability from three major approaches. So the most obvious one as a farm and as an operation, speaking of water, and I love that Chef brought it up, is that, so we're about 54, give or take, acres in San Diego County, almost all under greenhouse. And to put that in perspective, what that allows us to do is it allows us to output the capacity of about a 300-acre equivalent farm outdoors.
Wow.
And in order to sustain production across that same volume consumption of water, we're actually very fortunate where we are that we've actually invested in 6 wells, out of which we've actually been able to introduce some incredible efficiency gains in our water use, which I'll talk about in just a moment, to be able to utilize only 3 out of those 6 wells that we've drilled over the last 15 years. To put the water usage in perspective, some of the systems that we've introduced, and probably the most familiar one to most people, even not necessarily in the industry, would be hydroponics. So we're currently growing about an acre and a half or so of just tomatoes hydroponically. We have approximately 34 acres of it growing all different kinds of greens. That would be specialty greens at a small size for fine dining and high-end dining, as well as some legacy crops for Asian specialty markets. And what we've been able to deploy besides the hydroponics for the tomatoes and cucumbers and squash varieties is a method called fertigation. And the idea is that we can actually—
Did you make that up, by the way?
I didn't.
You did not?
Oh,
Okay.
yes, of course I did. No, I didn't. It's a term, and it refers to the idea that through a network of drip tapes, drip hoses, and in our case, we actually had to go the additional length of investing a little bit more in pressure-regulated hoses, because almost every part of our farm is on some kind of an incline. And if we didn't address that, we just have pools of water and wasting water thereby. And so instead of the typical setup of sprinklers and other overhead irrigation, we're actually, no pun intended, going from ground up. And the efficiency gains that I referred to earlier on just the waterfront is that when we first started farming on these 54-ish acres, we were consuming upwards about 150 to 160,000 gallons of water to feed that entire system per day. Wow. These days we'll average on a warm summer day about 45 to 50,000, and that's being conservative. So we're talking about a 2/3 reduction just by deploying some of these systems, and we actually haven't got to the 80% reduction that I'm confident we can get to, because in point 2 on the infrastructure-related improvement that we've made on the farm is that we also deployed enough solar panels to be able to run not only the existing 54 acres under greenhouse, but actually enough solar panels that we can actually triple that operating size if we wanted to. And the overage in the solar energy that we're depending on is so that we can actually automate the ventilation of all of these greenhouses. They do get hot. So if it's about 65, 70 degrees outdoors, it's a beautiful day. Inside of the greenhouses, unvented, we'd be looking at something like 100 to 110 degrees. Not safe for plants, and certainly not safe for my workers. So the ventilation system, there's a passive system where we're able to roll up all of the vents to ventilate. And there will also be an active management of it. Probably shouldn't say this, but I'm going to do it anyway. We've been testing a way to utilize running water to be able to piggyback off of the fact that our groundwater coming out of the wells is typically about 60 degrees. So let's utilize that temperature running out over the greenhouses in order to be able to feed off of that cooler temperature, instead of introducing forced air or other air conditioning systems that's just going to end up spitting out greenhouse gases or require fuel, burning propane, and everything in between to do this. So those are just a couple of the overarching infrastructural improvements that we've made and are currently working on the farm. The second element is what we're trying to do from a sustainability perspective from our employees. So I mentioned earlier that the biggest one would be that if we can improve the working environment for my workers, we're absolutely going to do it. But that also means that we're going to have to introduce some efficiencies in the tabletops that we grow some of these greens on. Less bending over to harvest, and easy to move things in and out. There's a pretty rigorous system to be able to move out the medium, the soil, quote unquote soil, that we're growing these greens on. That's also far more efficient. And I won't go too deep into the labor efficiency gains on that system now, except just to mention that that's actually going to allow more time where I can actually use that for the employees to do something else that only humans can do. I'm not going to go on the AI hype train and talk about how AI is going to transform small family farms and whatnot, but there is some of that. There is an element where we can actually focus our attention on only what people can do and let automation, semi-automation machines, and what can be invested in the technological front on small and larger scale farming to be able to do what only semi-automated / automated / machinery can do. And the third element of what ties a lot of this together is we at Girl and Doug Farm pride ourselves in growing what I've colorfully come to refer to over the years as roadside weed. And that's quite literally what they are. If you've seen a clover growing through cracks,
yeah, what kind of weed you mean?
Yes, and that's exactly where I'm going. I'm talking about weeds that grow on the ground, not the other one.
Grows on the ground too, just to say.
Yeah, and just quickly on that is there's actually a fairly simple, good reason that invasive weeds are as invasive as they are. And the short answer of that is they are just genetically very, very vigorous. And so if we can tap into that as a regular part of our diet, and they're delicious, by the way, I think that just involves a lot of consumer education on what some of these varieties are. That actually takes the pressure off of, let's say, the kales and the quinoas of the world, where a lot of land is being over-farmed for these varieties, not just in the States, but also across certain portions of South America, where we don't have to rely on that, put so much pressure on these few varieties. We can actually branch out to a number of other varieties out there. And that actually ties into, I love having Chef Michael here, the relationship that we at the farm are able to forge with chefs drives that consumer edutainment of these new varieties that are out there. Mm-hmm. And actually, it's not an accident that I mentioned kale and quinoa, because both of these have owe a lot of their now ubiquitous presence in retail markets and otherwise, and in all levels of dining, to fine dining, where a lot of this began, toasted quinoa, for instance, and different iteration of kale salad. And so if we can do that with hundreds, if not thousands, of other varieties, that's going to offer something by way of reducing waste on otherwise crops that are feeding into an oversaturated market for those particular varieties. So those are the three ways that we're focusing now on building out.
I mean, a couple of thoughts on that, right? What we eat is such a small percentage of what is available to be eaten. You know, shrimp and salmon, that's as if those are the only fish. And, you know, the same with like what we look at in the vegetable kingdom. I mean, we have to open our minds to not overeat and sort of ruin the land for just these very few focused things. But you didn't talk about organics, and a lot of people put sustainability and organic together in one bucket. So I just wonder if you could address that, and then we'll get to Diane.
Sure. So this actually goes right back to the point about water. I consciously made the decision a very, very long time ago to prioritize water reduction, water usage reduction, for the context of where our farm is located in northern San Diego, the context of what's been happening over the last 2 decades, actually a lot longer than that, but especially in the last 2 decades of increasingly intense drought-like conditions. It's not until literally the last few years, if even that we've actually had a decent amount of rain to fill up some of fill up our reservoirs in this state. So all of the measures that we've taken to be able to reduce our water usage has directly meant that we couldn't rely on all of the different varieties of organic fertilizers that I wanted to deploy. Two examples actually would be bone meal and fish blood, very, very common sources of fertilizers for growing tomatoes, strawberries, squash, for instance. The literal physical texture and makeup of those two fertilizers would wreak havoc on our entire irrigation system, where we're depending on literal drips by the hour, by the day. And actually, this is not just in theory, but in practice, when we had actually tried this out, that's exactly what had happened. And so it would become an unsustainable from an economic perspective. It would be economically unsustainable to have to figure out some other way than to unclog these systems. And so we're actually more of a hybrid approach where we're able to deploy conventional and organic fertilizers, pesticides and herbicides as well. And that's at least my plan. We're going to stay that way for a while yet until something better comes along.
Thank you. So, Joanne?
This is always such a hard question to answer. So I'm going to answer your first question, was how do I define sustainability, right? That has changed since I started my business in 2014, right? Now we're in 2024. And over the years, it has morphed and it has changed into something different. At the base level of it, when I talk about sustainability, what I mean is, in order for me to continue to have the privilege of access to a certain good or service, or even furthermore, for me to continue to do this service, for me to have that privilege of being able to walk in every day, do my job, but also not hurting anyone else in the process at all. So originally, when I was focusing on sustainability, I was really like hyper-focused on, well, what kind of packaging are we using? Where's our packaging coming from? How many trucks does it take to bring that to us? What's the carbon footprint of that? How much plastic are we using? Okay, we've got this greenware plastic that's compostable, but it can only be composted in a composting facility. So it's actually being composted, right? I let myself go down this rabbit hole of greenwashing and trying to figure out what were the right solutions for our business. Where my attention has shifted, and I feel like, I swear, it came at the right time. It happened before the pandemic. So when the pandemic hit, I wasn't blindsided. Like I felt like a lot of folks in our industry were. I was looking at the talent. So one of the things about my background is I'm a baker second. I originally did my degree in economics and I worked on my MBA. So I swore I was gonna have like this corporate job. And then I'm like, nah. I want to bake instead because that seems like mad fun. And so then I decided I was going to do that. And what ended up happening is that I'm looking at the talent pool of the people coming into our industry. And you're also listening to all the chatter around the people who work in our industry and the talent that comes into our industry. And also how people talk about the people who come and work in our industry, right? Or fast food even, if we take it to that level. And I'm looking and I'm like, these are rewarding careers where we do incredibly important work, which I think we all found out in the pandemic when you couldn't get your pizza when you wanted it, you couldn't get your ice cream when you wanted it. We had this, I need this now, and now we're not here, we're gone, just like that. And I realized that sustainability for our industry is more than just where are our raw materials coming from and how they're sourced. How are we making this sustainable careers for people? So a lot of my focus I'm going to say that probably happened in 2018, 2019, I had received a fellowship from the James Beard Foundation. And during that fellowship, we did this exercise where they were like, all right, you're gonna stand up here in front of all these people you don't know, and you're gonna say the thing out loud that you don't wanna say because you're embarrassed, or because you think people are gonna shoot it down, or they're gonna be like, that's nonsense, or that doesn't make any sense. And I went up there and I was like, we have got to start creating our own talent pools. I taught myself how to bake. Anyone can learn how to do this. We can learn how to do this, right? So, and the whole point of our fellowship was exploring expansion and growing, because that was like an amazing time for everyone in food, right? Like everybody was booming, so many amazing concepts were coming to market. And I was standing back and I said, you know, I've had no interest in having multiple gingered peaches. Like that's the baby, that's the one that made Joanne. I don't want more than one of those because it's high touch, it's incredibly difficult work to do, it's incredibly strenuous. That's not what I want for me. Instead, I went into other concepts that revolved around that. But what I realized is that what I want to do is I want to create this unique group of concepts that all support each other, similar to what you're talking about, what's happening here in LA. But I want to create the pool of talent that is going to help support that. So in order for me to do that, what I want to do is, instead of creating traditional commissary, I want to create a commissary that's a learning kitchen. I'm not sure if you're familiar with New Jersey, but where Lawrence is, Trenton, New Jersey is right here. And there's a lot of folks who look like me in Trenton, New Jersey, who don't have access, or there's a bunch of barriers to entry for the access, right? I don't have the transportation to get there. I can't afford culinary school. So instead, I went, time out. We're already suffocating in our buildings. New Jersey real estate is not a game. Like, what it costs to rent there is crazy. So you have to put a commissary far out. So instead of it just being a commissary, what if it becomes a teaching kitchen too? What if we take folks who are like, hey, I just want to do that. I want to learn that thing. And we bring them in and we teach them through action, through learning, through helping produce with and for us, right? And then 2 years later, 3 years later, you're like, all right, like I learned what I can, and we're like, go off and be like amazing, right? There's so many complexities to the labor movement and creating sustainable wages, livable wages, which is different everywhere that you go, but even access to healthcare, right? And then we're looking at these communities that have been segregated in terms of access to better jobs or training in trades. You have a community of people who are all like, we don't want to move just to get next to where the money is, or just to get, this is where we live, right? So when I think about sustainability, I'm looking at it from a perspective of how do I create the infrastructure for people to learn, for people to grow, and how do I create the opportunities for them to flourish within it so that we can support an entire community around us. And how that happened for me was gingered peach, the first thing, it explodes. I'm like, oh my God, what are we doing? The pandemic hits. Okay, so the crazy thing about this is I have these 3 businesses. One I had for like 9 years. The other 2 are less than 2 years old. And then there's another one that's getting ready to go under construction for a restaurant from us called Marmalade. It all came out of nowhere. And it started with gingered peach, and I was like, okay, this is what we're gonna do. And the demand was greater than what we could make, which isn't always a bad thing, but the pressure is real, right? Because you're like, I have to produce for the consumer, because again, people want what they want when they want it, and I gotta get this out. And then the opportunities that came after that, I ended up opening an ice cream shop because the person who owned the ice cream shop in town was like, I wanna retire, and I don't want the next person to get their hands on this place and destroy it, and destroy what it means. We wanna create, I wanted to stay where it is. And when I took a step back and I looked, I said, wait a minute. First of all, the ice cream shop is next door. It is literally, you go out my bakery door, it is behind it. And I was like, okay, so we've removed the logistics of point A to point B, right? I've now made it sustainable in terms of my labor force, right? Because I'm training you over here and I'm like, do you want to work next door tomorrow, right? So and then it started sending this message out of what was important to us, all at the same time when we've already done the packaging is green, and we just continue to translate that. And now going into, I have a coffee shop, but I have a coffee roastery. So now I'm now shifting back again, because how coffee beans are brought into our country, okay, and where they come from, and the brokers, and how that whole, now I have a whole nother task that I have to focus on. So while I love to say, for me, sustainability is, I'm kind of narrowed right here, there is a lot of balls in the air. But right now I'm hyper fixated on creating jobs that pay well so that this can be your only job. Mm-hmm. There's not two, there's not three, there's one. That this can be your only job, that you can get the benefits from that job, that you can see this as a career. One of the things that frustrates me that I'm hearing about, recently in California, minimum wage went up for your fast food workers, right? One of the things, and maybe I shouldn't be mad about this, but I am, and it drives me insane, is, well, that's not meant to be a job that you're, make a career. What? Why? Why is that not meant to be a job? Right? Why are we looking at jobs as these are only jobs that high school students should do? Work is work, labor is labor. So when I'm looking at sustainability in terms of our industry, I'm kind of like, how do we make this more sustainable for you to live off of?
Okay, we've got workforce development. Woo! Also, if anyone wants to ask questions, there can be the QR code. Oh, it's not working. She says it is working. Is it working?
It's a small room.
It's a small room. You also can just shout out afterwards. We're all very approachable here. Okay, so I have so many more questions for all of you on that, but I'm going to move forward a little bit and talk about where we find solutions, because we're at a crisis point, right? There's this question of what can we do in the future? What's the solution for the future? But the real question is, what can we do right now? And what we do right now has three components. It is looking at the past, it's looking at other cultures, and it's looking at what the opportunities for innovation are in the future, and probably other things. But that's how I think about it, right? Like it's a timeline, and so often we ignore the past and we ignore the present. And we're just jumping off to this land of innovation. So I'm going to shake it up, but I'm going to start with you, Rose, just with Go There Wines, and some of the thoughts of what you've gleaned from all the 30 countries you've traveled in, and where you're getting wine from, and also your restaurants draw from so many other cultures. So what are we not doing here, and what practices in the past, perhaps, that are more sustainable could we bring to our present in America?
No, when you Go There did come to mind right away, because I guess it is in the now, but it was informed by the past. I had a mission behind the wine programs at the restaurants the whole time. All the wines are chosen from what we generally call lesser known regions by lesser known winemakers, because we all know that the majority of the wine industry is dominated by white European men. And so it turns out there's a lot of places in the world that have been making wine a lot longer that the American market is just not familiar with. And so I thought the restaurants could be a great place and a great platform to say, hey, here's these cool wines from the Republic of Georgia, Lebanon, Bolivia, places that the average American does not know wine comes from, but actually has often been making wine much longer than Western Europe. And so the wine lists were dedicated to that. And I felt like that was making an impact, because I was privileged enough to travel and meet the winemakers behind these wine lists, visit their families, their farms, hear their stories. It's all life-changing. And then I thought, gosh, I want to help more. And while there's 4 restaurants open in DC and 1 here, that's a lot of wine, but that's still not as much wine as I want to bring into the country to help these individual winemakers. And so we, my husband and I, with a good friend of ours, started Go There Wines during the pandemic, because again, it was a crazy time and we wanted to feel like we were doing something. And Go There is a e-commerce site that really extends that mission, right? So we have 4 countries and 7 winemakers represented on our site, because I thought, this wine's amazing, but it's only getting to people in Washington, D.C. via my restaurants. I wanted to get to places like where I'm from in rural Ohio, where there is no cute wine store like we have in L.A., New York, D.C. And so direct to consumer and a lot of the regulations that were kind of relaxed a little during COVID, when we couldn't, go out and buy anything, it had to come to your door, made it a little bit easier to get wines to places like, Texas and Nebraska. And now we can get those wines to 48 states. And so that is, the baby steps towards. So I guess you could call it almost like a microeconomic development, right? We live in DC with a lot of USAID friends who are constantly giving, USAID loans to other countries to, I have a good friend who's specifically working with women women in Rwanda on how to open their own business because they make one product like soap. Well, how do we make, and I thought, well, I can do this too, because look how much product I buy, and a lot of it is from abroad. When you have Middle Eastern restaurants, all your ingredients are not available here all of the time. But I thought, how do I don't want to just like keep building and giving all of my money to these big companies, right? It takes effort, I'm not going to lie, to really narrow in on who your producers are and where everything is coming from. Much like you were talking about here in the US, if you want to buy from a small farmer or someone with sustainable principles, you have to work for it. It's not like, because the big guys, they have all the market share of the media and everything, and you're going to hear about them and you're going to know they exist. But you do, as business owners, I think we have a responsibility to do better, to be informed about where our products are coming from. And so, the wine company now is able to slowly build a fund for our winemakers through a profit-sharing model to actually get some of their dream dream projects. We all know wine is farming. It is so unpredictable. It is so scary. And with climate change, it is becoming harder and harder. It turns out that some of our countries like Lebanon and Georgia are actually currently a little less affected by climate change than Western Europe. We saw the fires in Spain last year. One of our winemakers and one of the very indigenous Lebanese grapes that we work with is called Merhois, and it's a mountain grape. And it comes from a very, very cold region, the top of the mountains. Climate change is not going to touch it for a while, inshallah, let's hope. And so now there's an opportunity for Eddie, our winemaker friend, to really accelerate production and possibly fill the need in the market that until hopefully things can stabilize in Europe. And I wish no ill on Europe in all of this, I should say. I love European wine. I just wanted to shout out to the guys that have been doing this, like the Georgians, for 8,000 years. And they just, because of economics, because of geography, because of war, we in the West, who have all this money to spend on wine, don't even know about it. And so I guess it's just responsible consumerism that I think as business owners, you do have to put the extra effort into. Sometimes it'll be more expensive. But again, as we build these new models, we're looking for ways like Made on Market here to share resources and make it to open up the market to folks that wouldn't have access to it otherwise. And so, yeah, that's kind of our attempt. And I will say countries like Lebanon, my ancestral homeland, have a history, so to go back to the past, of stuff just really being really freaking hard. Like whether it was war, occupation, drought, maybe it's just never gonna be easy. So we have to work a little bit harder with wine. We're also producing olive oil. It turns out where there's grapes, right, there's also olives. I use an insane amount of Lebanese unfiltered olive oil. And I'm like, why am I paying this import company? I can do this myself. And so I've mobilized a very small group of olive farmers to produce my first batch of olive oil. It's not enough for the restaurants, but it's a start. And so I bottled it for the consumers that come in who are like, why does your food taste so good? I'm like, half the battle of making this food is this amazing olive oil. You're not gonna be able to access it unless I put the platform here and let you know that there's these amazing small family farms in Lebanon who just need someone to give them a hand into this big market that the big guys are only gonna focus on what's easy. So that's my little way of doing it. I hope it makes the future better.
Yeah, sure, why not? We've got a small enough group, shout away.
So how much of that is challenged by just their ability to actually... Sorry about that. How much of this is sort of challenged by their ability just to produce enough to export? Because the best wine I ever had in Argentina, the best Malbec, the best wine I ever had in South Africa, they don't produce the best wine I ever had in Turkey. I asked, there's no way to get it here to the U.S. And so Ilili in New York has amazing Lebanese wines, right? Mm-hmm. But it's so hard to find wines from these remote regions where they produce enough to actually export it, even if they had the financial wherewithal.
Well, I actually think the majority of the time it is financial. I'll just give you an example. How I got into this was a Lebanese winemaker who I had met, who's now our winemaking partner at Go There. But at the time, Maidan had just opened. And he said, I have an amazing friend. He's a Syrian refugee. He can't make wine in Syria, so I'm giving him a little space in my little winery in Lebanon. But here's the thing. If he doesn't sell this entire first vintage, he will never be able to make any more. There will be no money. He's putting his entire life savings into it. Will you buy it? And like a very unwise business owner, I said, yes, of course, I will take the entire palette sight unseen. I understand not everybody can do that, but every so often, if we had a good year, I was like, let's just wing it. And worst case, I'll drink it. I don't know. The wine came in, it was unbelievable. But because of that, Abdullah was able to double his production the next year. So I do think it's commitments from people like that it can start. He has a savvy partner who does have business skills, but he has the creative skills, and they've joined forces. And as long as the money is coming in and there's a bit of a guarantee, and what Go There is also doing, we're fronting the money in some cases. We're saying, with our Georgian two sisters winemakers, Bayan Gavansa in Western Georgia, two of the most inspiring women you'll ever meet in your life. They took over their family winery in their mid-20s, and they're all over the world now. But still, to your point, small batches. But we've been watching them grow in the 10 years that we've been working with them because of commitment and investment from folks like me. And I'm not big. I only have 4 restaurants. That's not a big restaurant group. But I just said, okay, you guys have never experimented with pet nat. Pet nat is a type of wine that's not really fallen off the shelves in Georgia. They're much more traditional. They started to learn about it. They said, Rose, if you will buy the 1,500 bottles or the 2,000 bottles, we're going to give it a try. And I said the same thing, committed, I'll do it. It's unbelievable. They're able to make so much more now because of that upfront investment. We're doing it with a different grape. It's called Delshavi. The Soviets tried to destroy it when they took over the Bayan Gavansa's part of Georgia. It wasn't a useful grape. They wanted to plant tea, so they dug up all the vines. A couple families have been able to continue growing that Delshavi grape. Bayan Gavansa are committed to reinvigorating and just growing new vines where they were destroyed. But it's basically an endangered grape. And we said, if you make that wine, we will guarantee you the price of 2,000 bottles. It's usually around 2,000 to 3,000 that we commit up front. But because of that, they're able to innovate, they're able to experiment. Those wines are getting amazing ratings, but they wouldn't have even been able to create it without the upfront investment. And these are just micro loans, but I do think step by step, it is an investment in the future, but I do think that they'll get there to the point that you could have it at a Bev Mart or somewhere bigger, right? You're correct. You can't do that right now. They wouldn't have enough production, but the only way they will is if we start buying it now.
So it's an amazing program, really showcasing.
I'm sorry I don't have any for you right now. So we'll talk later and go.
But other thoughts on the past, present, future, sustainability? What are we learning from the past?
Well, I mean, I think there's so much. I mean, certainly, obviously, when it comes to fishing, like before fishing was such an industrialized, sort of business. It was just all like small boats. It was people fishing their local waters, for much smaller catches, and and if we remained at that sort of level, like people were just fishing to sustain their family and their community, then it would be in a much, our oceans would be in a much better place than they are right now. Of course, still, like there's the overarching problem of climate change, which is wreaking havoc all over the world with coral reefs bleaching and ocean acidification and just general temperature rise. Obviously, that's all, threatening fisheries as well. But really, our appetites have changed so much, and food is so global now. And we're loving species to death, like whether it's fish that's coming from the ocean or food that we raise on land. We're loving species to death, which is a real problem. Even just like packaging, we were talking about this earlier. Like everything that's sold to us as restaurateurs is, for the most part, comes in plastic. But there was a time in this world before plastic where goods and services and products were shipped in tin and glass and wood, and that's just not it's not cheap. Our societies nowadays, especially here in the West, is all about convenience and price, and we don't necessarily. I think we as consumers, we need to find the value in in goods and services that have made some sort of commitment to the planet, unless we're willing to pay for fair trade coffee and fair trade chocolate and fish that's caught sustainably and products that are in glass or tin as opposed to plastic. If we don't see the value in that as a society, then we're just honestly, I just think like we're just going to ride this wave right till the end, I guess. We talked about it earlier, climate doom, and your new project is all about kind of like dispelling that idea for people. I think there's so much to be learned from the past in all aspects of what we consume as Americans and as citizens of the world.
one of the things that I definitely think can be learned from the past, as much as things change, there's just certain things that kind of hold tried and true. And whenever I think through this whole in order for this sustainable movement to really take hold and to have the impact that it needs to have, it brings us right back to prisoner's dilemma. We're right back there. You know, if I do this, right, if you and I are together and we're in separate rooms, and all right, if you snitch on her, you'll get 0 years and she'll get 10 years. But if we cooperate together we will end up in the better case scenario for both of us. Every time I play, so I'm from New Jersey, so we've got the boardwalk. Every time I play skee ball, anybody play skee ball, like the you roll, right? I never go for the 5,000s. Never. They're impossible. They're impossible. You roll it and you might get it, right? That is the equivalent of me snitching on you so you get 10 years and I have 0, right? I tend to be the person who always goes for the 3,000, which is like right in the middle. I've nailed it. I know how to hit it. I can hit it consistently every single time, right? In order for this movement to actually stay and work and have impact, cooperation is key. It's all of us agreeing that we are all going to do it. And but I think we're so caught up in this mindset of, well, I gotta look out for number one. I have to make sure that I'm always protected. I have to make sure that this is always where it needs to be, right? We forget that data is data for a reason, and stats are stats for a reason, right? And we can go back and reference them. And if you say 9 times out of 10, if all 4 of us agree with like the power that we have on this stage to do this one thing, it's going to impact someone else, and then they're going to get on board, and they're going to board. It is a long road, but we have to remember that there is power in agreeing that we cooperate, and then also encouraging others to do that too. I think we get so lost in the I'm just one person. I mean, what am I going to do?
You literally have just said the entire thesis of my new project, Progressive Hedonist. That was it. So I'm true. We do need to cooperate, and we need one person at a time. One last question, then we'll turn it over, and you can. I don't know if you have questions or they're not QR coding, but what do we need in terms of policy? What do we need in terms of innovation? Like, what are we looking at that would, for food and ag and restaurants and all that, like, where are the game changers? Where are the optimism and where's the opportunity?
I'll field the farming bit. That's to the extent that I can speak to. So kind of bouncing off of the last couple of points, what we're doing on one small farm, we're one out of, I just read, this was actually a 22 stat, so it's a little dated, USDA stats from 2022, so little dated, 23 I don't think is available yet, but 88%, 88 and change percent of the farms in the United States right now are considered small farms. And there's varying definitions of what small farm means. You can categorize that into family-owned, but family-owned can actually include pretty large farms. And so it doesn't stray a whole lot from that 88 and change percent or so. By some metrics, it could be as high as 95, 96%. What I see there is an incredible opportunity not just to create this new basket for investment and go, oh, we need to invest in all these small farms, but rather to look at one specific pain point and its relation to some of the other pain points around it. So if we're looking at something like food waste, it's not just, it's pitifully lacking just to say, well, we're going to reduce farm waste or food waste or retail shelf, waste by umpteen percentage. It's too vague just to leave it at that. But if we look at some of the immediate causes and some of the contributors to that, so for instance, 30 to 40% of the food produced is wasted in the U.S., and that's actually a 2023 stat. And that's global.
I mean,
yeah.
It's true here and it's true across the world. a billion meals a day go wasted.
And of that, about 70% is ag waste. For all the different nuances, I won't go into what all of them are, but for all of the nuances of agriculture waste, that's wasted between post-farming waste. So in other words, however much is produced on the farms, once it leaves the farm, somewhere down in that transportation chain, 70% of it is wasted. And yet, and there's another corresponding stat as of, this is also 2022 USDA data, 1 in 8, about 12.9, 12.8% of households in America are food insecure for all of the different definitions of food insecurity. 12.8, 12.9%. There's something very, very wrong with those numbers. Yeah. And instead of proposing broad range of we can do this, we can do this, we can do this, at least for our part, the point going back to introducing other varieties, and again, even that itself would be, I think, too broad of a point, but if we can tie that to how do we popularize this, I'll give you 2 quick examples. I'm Korean. I grew up in the States. I came here when I was 5.5, so I remember practically nothing about my native South Korea. But having 2 older sisters, 7 and 9 years older than myself, and Korean immigrant parents who speak a little bit of English, that's actually kept me very well within the sphere of Korean cuisine. And so within that, I grew up eating this class of dishes that we in Korean call namu. And it refers to an entire base of dishes that center around different kinds of weeds, as I mentioned earlier. And in the early days of my going out and visiting and meeting chefs one at a time, I had found that it was a hunch at first, but it was very gratifying, rewarding, and humbling to see that some of the world's best chefs were going nuts over these things that I've come to term it this way: one man's weed is another man's treasure. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity there. It would be a little too broad for me to say, oh, see, that's just me, with Korean food, and multiply that by the number of cultures that exist in the world, and you've got thousands of species that I think that would still be too broad, but we can hone in on what are the current food trends, and we've got umpteen amounts of data and surveys that we can pull for that. What kinds of flavors are people into now? What are they searching for? We had a whole panel yesterday about the future of retail food that discussed exactly that point. So if we can at least, again, try to steer, at least for one part, at least steer the general consumer's demand for new varieties, I think that eventually becomes a demand generation where the more they get exposed to these new varieties, like, oh, I never knew that about this thing called sesame leaf, or this thing. Another example would be pigweed. It's literally translated pigweed from Korean. And one of my managers on the farm got really excited about that. At first, he laughed and then got really excited about it because he called it, or nicknamed it, vaca, or chivo. That's cow or goat in Spanish, because that's what cows and goats eat in Mexico, where he's from. And so we're getting excited about this common ingredient. We're going, well, wait a minute, this thing, which turned out to be purslane or verdolaga, is an amazingly invasive little weed.
So basically, really, you're looking at the future of innovation being taking our weeds more seriously and eating them, and they have survived a lot. So that is amazing. Michael, you want to talk about policy as part of this? And is there anyone who wants to ask a question before we get into the policy?
Do you certify your hydroponic crops as organic?
No. So that goes to the decision that we made. Right now, because there are 2 fertilizers that we use that are conventional, we're not able to get certified organic. But for all of the practices, there's certain parts of the farm that are actually regenerative techniques where we're actually growing a lot of greens that will be good for the soil if we till them back up and get them right back in there. So sections of it that are utilizing cover crop in that regard, hydroponic sections that depend on a slew of fertilizers. But all in all, because the entire operation doesn't run on a single system of organic fertilizers, we won't be certified, but we're going to continue down the approach in the name of saving water.
I think you got a question.
Yeah, the food tech world is in the early. Sorry, the food tech world is in the early stages of developing, essentially, I'll call it artificial meat, fish, etc., but on a cellular level look like meat and fish. So they presumably can be used culinarily like that. Is that something that you guys, I guess mostly on the restaurant side, are considering adopting at some point down the road?
I've had like lots of people contact me through email or phone, by phone or direct message on social media about trying to get me to taste that stuff, and I refuse because I feel like I feel like it's giving up on the planet.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like if that's where we are, where our only hope is to create food in a lab, then I honestly I want no part of it, and I hope that's not my children's future. You know, I really do. I hope that we take food policy and our own impact on the environment and the impact of our communities and our countries as seriously enough to create a future where food can still be like natural and wholesome, and not created at a cellular level in a lab. My father was a chemist. I dedicated my life to being a chef and to like savoring the quality of ingredients. And you cannot create that in a lab. You just can't. Just like you can't create, I work primarily with fish, and we are we made a commitment early on to only work with wild fin fish. We use farm-raised shellfish, but we don't use farm-raised fin fish. And the reason for that is because it pales in comparison in terms of flavor to wild fish. You take farm-raised salmon and put it up against its wild counterpart, the wild fish is always going to taste better. And by the way, by making that commitment, I feel like it's much more than just farm races versus wild, but behind every wild fish that finds its way to market, there is a community. You know what I mean? It's not just about the boats on the dock. When you go to a fishing village, turn around and look at the churches and the schools and the kids on the playground, all of that supported by commercial fishing. I feel like, as a chef, I have a responsibility to continue to support that for the future. It's the type of ingredient where if you don't use it, you lose it. And if we don't place a value on these kinds of legacy ingredients, wild fish, things like that, then they will disappear. And I feel like that move towards lab-grown meat and fish is just another nail in the coffin for something that I hold so dear and precious. And I wish more of us did.
And I think that also we want to save the ocean, we want to save the land, that they are so important to us for other reasons. And if we just move everything into a lab and move money away from saving the oceans and saving the soil, there's so many unintended consequences or just plain old consequences. You had a question?
Yeah. So, as a amateur gardener enthusiast, some of the best knowledge that I ever learned was actually from my grandparents growing up, gardening specifically for small farms and for your work around the world with small farmers globally. How are we capturing the, old wives' tale kind of knowledge that turns out to be truly beneficial for sustainability, and how are we using that to inform the practices going forward in the industry?
Quickly with the international community, there's, my quick experience is that there's been a lot less innovation, and so a lot of those old wives' tales and lore and traditions are still actually the mainstay in a lot of the places that I go, but I'm traveling to the majority of the Middle East, to a lot of places that are way, way, way less developed. And so everything we just have this very privileged Western perspective when we speak. Like we all do it. Those of us that were, raised here, and it was travel that, again, I'm very privileged to have been able to do that allowed me to see that. There's just huge swaths of the world that just don't do it like we do. One of the questions I get a lot in the restaurant is, well, it doesn't taste quite like it did in Georgia. It doesn't taste like it did in Lebanon. I'm like, well, one of the first problems I had was I wanted to make a Georgian cheese bread. It's called hajapuri, for those of you that haven't had it. It's like the national food of Georgia. I lived in Russia with my husband for 3 years, which is how I got to know all these Georgian things. And I was like, this has to be in my first restaurant. And I went to the ambassador from Georgia, because I live in DC. So I was able to go down to Embassy Row and be like, Ambassador, I really want to do honor to your food, and I want to do all these things, but I need your help. I want to be respectful. He's like, well, you're going to have a problem with cheese. I was like, what are you talking about? And he's like, yeah, the cheese that we use for this dish, salguni, the US will never let it be imported. So you're gonna have to mimic it here. So then I went out to Maryland and Virginia, and I went to all the dairy farmers, and I'm like, how can I make this cheese? And it was finally Mary, the farmer, who also worked for the Department of Agriculture on the side, and she was like, I'm sorry, hon. I am never going to be able to produce this cheese for you. The reason it tastes different there, right? It's the water. It's the fact that these cows just roam freely. They're not shot with any hormones. You are never, ever going to have that cheese taste here. Now, I'd like to think I mix 3 cheeses and get as close to that flavor as I can, but I'm the first one to admit it's not the same. So I think there's still so many ways abroad that things are be done the old way. I think some of it we can bring. I will also admit some of it is not sustainable and I've seen some horribly irresponsible things in that part of the world too. But I do think that there's some really good habits, like supporting like a grape that's going to go extinct in Georgia by just like focusing on it and supporting it with like even a little bit of funds will make a difference. But there is huge parts of the world that are still going by these, and I guess my note would be travel and see it if you can, and speak to them one-on-one and record it as much as you can.
And I think that's what we have. Oh, session's over.
Yeah, I saw it go up right as we were talking.
But thank you. Thanks all for all of you, my favorite panel of experts, and thanks all of you for joining us.
Thanks, Dana.
We got more bounce in California.